When little Apache found giant Mule in his barn, all laughed until he saved the whole village in the dusty Apache village of Red Mesa. 10-year-old Aiyana was the smallest boy anyone could remember. The other children called him Little Apache and laughed when he struggled to carry water buckets or fell behind during hunting lessons. The adults shook their heads sadly, wondering how such a tiny boy would ever become a warrior. But one morning when Aiyana went to feed the chickens in his family's old barn, he discovered something that would change everything. Hidden in the shadows stood the largest mule he had ever seen, bigger than any horse the village warriors rode, with eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. When Aiyana told the village elders about his discovery, they dismissed it as another wild story from the boy with the big imagination. They had no idea that within days, this unlikely pair would face a threat that would test every ounce of courage they possessed. But how could a small boy and a mysterious mule possibly save an entire village from destruction? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the red earth of the village as Aiyana trudged toward the communal well, his small hands gripping the handles of 2 water buckets that seemed far too large for his frame. Other children his age carried their buckets with ease, racing each other to see who could fill them fastest. Aiyana moved slowly, carefully, knowing that if he hurried, the weight would cause him to stumble and spill precious water across the dusty ground. "Look at little Apache," called out Nalnish, a boy 2 years older whose voice carried the casual cruelty that children wield without understanding its power. "Still moving like an old grandmother." The other children giggled, and Aiyana felt his cheeks burn with familiar shame. His grandmother Shimasani had given him the name Aiyana, meaning eternal blossom, but the village children had long ago replaced it with their own nickname. Little Apache had stuck like burrs on a blanket, impossible to remove no matter how hard he tried. His grandmother waited for him on the wooden porch of their small adobe home, her weathered hands working steadily on a beadwork project that would eventually become part of someone's ceremonial dress. Shimasani was one of the village's most respected elders, a woman whose knowledge of traditional ways commanded reverence from warriors and chiefs alike. Yet even her standing could not shield her grandson from the daily reality of being different in a community that valued strength and size above all else. "The water is heavy today," she observed gently as Aiyana set down his buckets with visible relief. "The water is always heavy, grandmother," he replied, settling beside her on the porch, where the morning shade provided respite from the growing heat. Shimasani's fingers never paused in their delicate work as she spoke. "Your grandfather was small too when he was your age. The other boys called him names, said he would never be a warrior. But he became the finest tracker our people ever knew. Size has nothing to do with seeing clearly, my grandson. Sometimes the smallest eyes notice what the largest." Aiyana had heard variations of this story many times, but today something in his grandmother's tone made him pay closer attention. She reached into the leather pouch that always hung from her belt, withdrawing a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. The medicine bundle had been in their family for generations, passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, containing herbs and sacred items that connected them to the spirit world. "Today feels different," Shimasani continued, her dark eyes scanning the horizon where heat waves already shimmered above the distant mesas. "The spirits are restless. Change is coming to Red Mesa, and when it arrives, those who see clearly will be needed more than those who see only with their eyes." Before Aiyana could ask what she meant, the sound of running feet interrupted their conversation. His younger cousin Kaya appeared around the corner of the house, her braids flying behind her as she raced toward them with the urgency that marked important news in a small village. "Aiyana, your father wants you at the barn immediately. He says the chickens are acting strange and something has been disturbing the feed." Aiyana's father Goyathle was a practical man who worked as the village's blacksmith, his strong arms and patient nature making him valuable for maintaining tools and horseshoes. He rarely asked for help with simple tasks like feeding chickens, preferring to handle such chores himself rather than risk his son's inevitable mistakes. The barn sat at the edge of their property, a structure built by Aiyana's great-grandfather using traditional methods that had kept it standing for over 50 years. The weathered wooden planks had witnessed countless seasons, their surface worn smooth by wind and rain, carved with the initials and marks of 3 generations who had sought shelter within its walls. The building held the accumulated secrets and stories of their family, a repository of memory built from timber that had grown in the sacred mountains. As Aiyana approached the barn, he noticed that his father was nowhere to be seen. The chickens huddled together in one corner of their enclosed area, their usual morning chatter replaced by nervous clucking and anxious head movements. Something had indeed disturbed them, but what? He pushed open the heavy wooden door, its hinges creaking with the voice of age. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that penetrated the gaps between the planks, and the familiar smells of hay and animal feed filled his nostrils. But there was something else, a different scent, musky and wild, that spoke of creatures not meant for domestic barns. Aiyana called out for his father, his voice echoing in the empty space. No response. He stepped further inside, his eyes adjusting to the dimmer light, and moved toward the feed bins, where the chicken disturbance had supposedly occurred. That was when he saw it. In the far corner of the barn, partially hidden by bales of hay stacked higher than his head, stood the largest mule Aiyana had ever imagined. The animal was massive, taller at the shoulder than his father's finest horse, with a coat that seemed to shift colors in the filtered light. Sometimes it appeared deep brown, other times almost black, and occasionally it seemed to hold flecks of silver that caught the sun like stars. But it was the mule's eyes that captured Aiyana's attention completely. They were ancient eyes, wise and knowing, holding depths that suggested intelligence far beyond any ordinary animal. The mule watched him with the patience of stone, showing no fear or aggression, merely acknowledgement that they had finally encountered each other as destiny intended. Aiyana approached slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. The mule remained perfectly still, allowing the boy to come close enough to see the intricate patterns in its coat, the careful way it positioned its hooves to avoid damaging the barn floor, the almost human-like expression of curiosity in its gaze. "Where did you come from?" Aiyana whispered, extending his hand toward the animal's magnificent head. The mule lowered its nose to sniff his palm, its breath warm and sweet, like summer grass. In that moment, Aiyana felt something shift inside him, a recognition that this encounter would change everything, though he could not yet understand how or why. He spent nearly an hour in the barn with the mule, talking softly while the animal listened with the attention of a wise elder hearing an important story. When he finally emerged, running toward the village center with news that he was certain would amaze and delight everyone, his excitement made his small legs move faster than they ever had before. The village elders were gathered in their usual spot beneath the great cottonwood tree, discussing the day's concerns with the gravity that important decisions required. Aiyana burst into their circle, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to share his discovery. "There is a giant mule in our barn. Bigger than any horse in the village. It has eyes like the ancient ones, and it understood everything I said to it." The elders exchanged glances that spoke of patient tolerance for children's fantasy. Chief Cochise, a man whose leadership had guided Red Mesa through many challenges, smiled with the kindness reserved for enthusiastic youngsters whose imaginations exceeded their judgment. "Little Apache," he said gently, "it is good that you want to help and be part of important things, but we have serious matters to discuss today. Perhaps you should return home and help your grandmother with her work." "But it is true," Aiyana insisted, his voice rising with frustration that was all too familiar. "Come and see for yourselves. The mule is there, I promise you." Several of the younger warriors chuckled, and Aiyana felt the familiar heat of embarrassment creep up his neck. These were the same men who dismissed his offers to help with hunting expeditions, who suggested he might be better suited for women's work than warrior training, who saw his small size as evidence of limitation rather than potential. "We will look into it later, young one," Chief Kachis said with finality. "Now go home. The men have work to do." Aiyana walked home with heavy steps, the weight of disbelief more crushing than any water bucket he had ever carried. But as he approached the barn, determination began to replace disappointment. If the adults would not come to see the mule, perhaps he could find a way to bring proof to them. The mule was exactly where he had left it, standing in the shadows like a patient guardian waiting for his return. This time, Aiyana noticed details he had missed in his initial excitement. Around the animal's neck hung what appeared to be an old bridle, but unlike any he had seen before. The leather was dark with age, decorated with intricate beadwork and symbols that seemed to shimmer when they caught the light. The symbols were unlike anything in his experience, not Apache designs, but something older, more mysterious. They seemed to move slightly when he was not looking directly at them, creating patterns that suggested meaning just beyond his understanding. The bridle itself was clearly ancient, its leather supple despite obvious age, as if it had been crafted by hands that understood secrets lost to modern times. "Where did you come from, Great One?" Aiyana asked, settling cross-legged in the hay before the magnificent animal. To his amazement, the mule began to move closer, lowering its massive head until it was level with the boy's face. The ancient eyes seemed to bore into his soul, and for a moment, Aiyana felt as if he could hear thoughts that were not his own. Images of vast distances traveled, of purposes larger than any single village, of waiting for the right moment and the right person. The mule's breath was warm against his face as it gently nuzzled his cheek, and Aiyana felt a connection form between them that transcended ordinary understanding between human and animal. This was partnership, recognition, the beginning of something that his grandmother's stories had taught him to recognize as destiny. "You are not from this world, are you?" he whispered, and the mule's eyes seemed to confirm his growing suspicion. His grandmother's tales had spoken of spirit animals that appeared in times of great need, creatures sent by the ancestors to guide and protect the people. They came in different forms, sometimes as eagles that could see danger from great distances, sometimes as wolves that could track enemies through the darkest nights, sometimes as creatures that existed between the everyday world and the realm of spirits. Aiyana examined the bridle more carefully, noting that the beadwork incorporated stones and materials he could not identify. Some of the beads seemed to contain tiny flames that flickered without heat, while others held what looked like miniature storms, complete with lightning that danced within their crystalline depths. The leather itself was unmarked by wear, despite its obvious antiquity. "The symbols," he murmured, tracing them with his finger. "They are a language, are not they?" As his finger followed the patterns, he began to sense their meaning, not through knowledge, but through intuition that came from somewhere deeper than his conscious mind. The symbols spoke of journeys across sacred lands, of protection given to those who showed courage beyond their size, of power that came not from strength of arm, but from purity of heart. One symbol in particular drew his attention, a small figure that looked remarkably like a child standing beside a much larger animal. Around them were arranged other symbols that suggested danger approaching from one direction and safety leading in another. The message seemed clear. This partnership between small human and mighty beast had been foretold, prepared for, waited for, across generations. "You have been looking for me," Aiyana said with sudden certainty, "and I have been looking for you, though I did not know it." The mule nickered softly, a sound that seemed to confirm his understanding. Then, to Aiyana's wonder, the animal began to move toward the barn door, clearly expecting him to follow. The boy scrambled to his feet, his heart racing with excitement and nervousness in equal measure. Outside the barn, the mule demonstrated abilities that defied ordinary animal behavior. It moved with a grace that seemed to barely touch the ground, its hooves making no sound on the rocky earth. When it paused to look back at Aiyana, the boy understood that he was being invited to witness something remarkable. The mule approached a large boulder that sat near the property line, a stone that Aiyana's father had always said was too heavy to move and would simply have to be worked around. The animal positioned itself carefully, placed its shoulder against the stone, and pushed with what appeared to be minimal effort. The boulder, which must have weighed several tons, rolled aside as easily as if it were made of dried tumbleweeds. Aiyana's mouth fell open in astonishment. No ordinary animal possessed such strength, no matter how large. This was power of a different kind, entirely, the kind his grandmother's stories reserved for beings touched by the spirit world. "Tomorrow," he said with growing confidence, "I will bring witnesses. They will have to believe when they see what you can do." But even as he spoke, Aiyana wondered if the adults would find ways to explain away even the most obvious demonstrations of supernatural ability. In his experience, grown-ups had remarkable talent for seeing only what fit their existing understanding of how the world worked. The mule seemed to understand his concern, nuzzling his shoulder with gentle reassurance that spoke of patience and wisdom earned through long experience with human nature. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As the sun began its descent toward the western mesas, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that matched the earth beneath their feet, Aiyana made his way back to his grandmother's porch. Shimasani was waiting for him, her beadwork set aside, her expression holding the knowing look that suggested she had been expecting important news. "The spirit spoke truly today," she said before he could utter a word. "Change has found its way to you, my grandson." "Grandmother, there is a mule in our barn that is not like other mules. It understands me, and I understand it, and it can move boulders as if they were pebbles." Shimasani nodded, as if such things were perfectly reasonable. "The ancient bridle has found its way home then. I wondered when it would return to our family." Aiyana stared at her in amazement. "You know about the bridle? My great-grandmother told me stories of such things, passed down from the time when our people first came to these lands. The bridle belongs to a guardian spirit, a being that appears when great trials approach. It chooses its human partner carefully, looking not for the strongest or the fastest, but for the one whose heart is pure and whose courage is greater than his fear." The old woman's words sent shivers down Aiyana's spine. "What kind of trials, grandmother?" "The kind that test not just individual bravery, but the strength of an entire community. The kind that require wisdom to know when to fight and when to protect, when to stand firm and when to bend like grass before the wind." As if summoned by her words, a distant sound drifted across the village, the rhythmic beating of horses' hooves. Too many horses moving too fast to be friendly visitors. The sound was still far away, but it carried the urgency of men with purpose that might not align with the peaceful intentions of Red Mesa's residents. Shimasani rose from her chair with the swift movement of a woman whose age had not dulled her instincts for danger. "It begins," she said simply. "Go to your mule, grandson. Your destiny calls earlier than I expected." The sound of approaching horses grew stronger as night fell over Red Mesa, and with it came a tension that spread through the village like smoke from a signal fire. Warriors emerged from their homes carrying weapons and moving with the purposeful stride of men who understood that peaceful evenings could transform into deadly encounters without warning. The normal sounds of village life, children playing, women preparing evening meals, elders sharing stories, faded into watchful silence. Aiyana's father appeared at their door, his blacksmith's hammer hanging from his belt alongside a knife that rarely left its sheath, except for ceremonial occasions. Goyathle's face carried the grim expression of a man who had hoped his son would grow up in more peaceful times, but had always known such hope might prove too optimistic. "Strange riders have been spotted along the southern ridge," he told Shimasani, his voice low but carrying clearly in the still air. "3 scouts, watching our village for 2 days before disappearing back into the desert. Chief Kokhiza believes they are advance men for a larger force." The village had prospered in recent years, their skilled craftsmen producing pottery, silverwork, and woven goods that traders carried to distant markets. Word of their success had spread beyond friendly trading partners to reach the attention of those who preferred taking to earning. Bandit groups had grown bolder as settlements expanded into previously empty territories, and Red Mesa's relative isolation made it an attractive target for men willing to ride far from law and civilization. Shimasani listened to her son's report while her fingers unconsciously sought the medicine bundle at her belt. The sacred herbs and ceremonial items had been blessed by generations of medicine women, imbued with protective power that could ward off evil spirits, but offered limited defense against bullets and steel blades. "How many warriors can we muster?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer would be insufficient. 17 men of fighting age, Goyathle replied. "Perhaps 20 if we include the older boys who have completed their warrior training, but lack experience in real combat. Against raiders who have chosen us as their target, it may not be enough." Chief Kachis had called for a council meeting at the ceremonial fire pit, where the village's war paint bowl sat ready to be filled with the sacred pigments that warriors applied before battle. The ceramic vessel was ancient, its surface decorated with symbols that represented courage, strength, and protection from enemy weapons. It had been used by Apache warriors for generations, a tangible connection to ancestors who had faced similar threats with similar courage. As the men gathered around the fire, their faces painted with flickering shadows and orange light, the discussion quickly turned to practical matters of defense. The village's layout offered some advantages. The buildings were arranged in a rough circle around the central plaza, providing fields of fire for defenders while limiting attackers' ability to approach unseen. But the adobe walls that sheltered families would provide little protection against determined assault, and the village's water source lay outside the defensive perimeter. Young Narnish, the boy who had mocked Aiyana that morning, stood near his father among the warriors, his chest painted with symbols of eagle and lightning that proclaimed his readiness for battle. At 12, he was considered old enough to fight beside the men, his size and strength already approaching that of some adults. He caught sight of Aiyana hovering at the edge of the gathering and gestured dismissive. "Little Apache should go home to his grandmother," Narnish called out, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "This is no place for children who cannot lift a war club." Several warriors chuckled, and Aiyana felt the familiar burn of humiliation. But tonight, something was different. Tonight he possessed knowledge that none of these brave men shared. Knowledge of a guardian spirit waiting in his family's barn, of power that could move boulders and might be capable of far more impressive demonstrations. "I could help," Aiyana said, his voice smaller than he wished but carrying more conviction than usual. "I know things about—" "You know nothing about war, boy," interrupted Delshi, one of the village's most respected warriors. "Go home before you get underfoot when real men are planning real strategies." Chief Kachis raised his hand for silence, his authority ending the mockery, but not the dismissal. "Every person in Red Mesa has value," he said diplomatically, "but this council is for those who will carry weapons when trouble comes. Aiyana, your heart is brave, but your place is with the women and children who will need protection." The words stung because they contained enough truth to make arguing seem futile. Aiyana was small, inexperienced, and possessed no training in the warrior arts that would make him useful in conventional combat. But as he walked away from the fire, his grandmother's words echoed in his mind. "Sometimes the smallest eyes notice what the largest miss." He made his way to the barn, where the mule waited in patient silence, its ancient eyes reflecting starlight that filtered through gaps in the wooden walls. The magnificent animal seemed to sense his frustration and disappointment, nuzzling his shoulder with gentle understanding that helped ease the pain of rejection. "They do not believe in you," Aiyana whispered, "and they do not believe in me. But grandmother says great trials are coming, and you chose me for some reason. What are we supposed to do?" The mule moved toward the barn door, clearly expecting him to follow. Outside, the night air carried sounds that had not been present earlier, distant voices speaking in languages that did not belong to the Apache tongue, the soft jingle of metal equipment being adjusted for movement, the careful footsteps of men trying to approach without detection. From their position behind the barn, Aiyana and the mule could see across the valley toward the ridge where scouts had been spotted earlier. Tiny points of light flickered in the darkness, campfires positioned to be visible only from specific angles. The raiders were no longer hiding their presence. They wanted Red Mesa to know that morning would bring violence to the peaceful village. The mule snorted softly and pawed the ground with one massive hoof, its message clear even without words. Whatever was coming, they would not wait for permission to act. The warriors at the council fire were brave men, planning brave strategies, but they were thinking like ordinary humans facing ordinary threats. Aiyana was beginning to understand that the trials his grandmother had mentioned might require extraordinary responses. As he stood beside the guardian spirit in the darkness, watching enemy fires burn on distant ridges while his own people prepared for a battle they might not be able to win, the small boy felt something shifting inside him. The part of him that had always apologized for being different, that had accepted limitation as permanent fact, began to make room for possibility he had never dared imagine. Tomorrow would bring tests that no Apache warrior had faced in living memory. But tonight, for the first time in his life, Aiyana felt ready to meet whatever challenges awaited him. Dawn broke gray and threatening over Red Mesa, the usual golden light replaced by clouds that hung low and heavy like smoke from distant fires. The raiders had moved during the night, their campfires now visible from multiple directions around the valley, creating a rough circle that spoke of coordinated strategy and experienced leadership. Chief Cochise stood atop the highest adobe building in the village center, an ornate eagle feather staff in his weathered hands, surveying the approaching threat with the calm expression of a man who had faced death many times before. The eagle feather staff was one of Red Mesa's most sacred artifacts, its polished wooden shaft decorated with feathers from birds that had soared above Apache lands for countless generations. Each feather represented a victory won through courage and wisdom, bound together with leather strips that contained prayers for protection and strength. The staff had been carried into battle by chiefs and war leaders, stretching back to the earliest days of their people, and its presence in Cochise's hands told every villager that this day would test their courage as few days ever had. From his position on the rooftop, Cochise could count at least 40 riders positioned at strategic points around the valley. They were well armed and well organized, their horses fresh and their equipment suggesting resources far beyond those of casual bandits. These were men who made war their profession, who had planned this assault with the thoroughness that came from successful experience in similar ventures. Below in the village plaza, warriors applied war paint with steady hands while women and children gathered supplies that would sustain them through a siege. The older boys who had completed their training but lacked battle experience stood ready to prove themselves, their faces painted with symbols of their animal guides and protective spirits. Nalnish bore the lightning symbol of his namesake, while others displayed eagles, bears and wolves that represented their spiritual guardians. Shimasani moved through the preparations with the purposeful efficiency of a woman who had lived through conflicts that younger generations knew only through stories. Her medicine bundle hung prominently from her belt, its sacred contents available to bless weapons and provide spiritual protection to warriors who understood that physical courage alone might not be sufficient for the trials ahead. But her eyes kept searching the crowd for her grandson, who seemed to have disappeared when he should have been helping to move supplies to safety. Aiyana had indeed vanished from the common preparations, but not from cowardice or childish fear. He had spent the pre-dawn hours in the barn with the mule, both of them sensing the approach of destiny with the clarity that came when supernatural awareness met mortal danger. The magnificent animal had been restless throughout the night, pacing within the confines of the barn with energy that seemed to radiate from its massive frame. "Today you will show them," Aiyana whispered, his small hands stroking the mule's neck where the ancient bridle rested like a crown of power. "Today they will understand that strength comes in forms they never expect." The mule's response was to move toward the barn door with deliberate intent, clearly ready to emerge from hiding and take its place in the coming conflict. But as they stepped outside, Aiyana could see that the moment for revelation had not yet arrived. The village warriors were focused on conventional notions, checking arrows, sharpening blades, positioning themselves behind walls and barriers that would provide cover during the attack. They were thinking like men who expected to fight other men using familiar weapons and tact. They were not prepared to witness or understand the intervention of powers that existed beyond the ordinary world. From the eastern approach came the sound that every defender had been dreading, the thunder of many horses moving at attack speed, accompanied by war cries in languages that spoke of violence and conquest. The raiders were making their move, confident in their numbers and firepower, certain that a small Apache village could offer little effective resistance to their assault. Chief Claudius raised the eagle feather staff high above his head, its sacred feathers catching the gray morning light as he called out the traditional words that Apache warriors had spoken before battle since time immemorial. Today we fight not just for ourselves, but for our children and our children's children. Today we prove that the spirit of our ancestors lives in our hearts. The warriors responded with their own war cries, voices lifted in defiance and determination that echoed across the valley. But even as they shouted their courage to the morning sky, the sound of approaching enemies grew louder and more threatening, promising violence that would test every man's resolve to its limits. Aiyana watched from beside the barn as the first raiders crested the ridge to the east, their silhouettes dark against the clouded sky. They rode with the confidence of men who had done this many times before, who knew that isolated villages rarely possessed the numbers or weapons to mount effective resistance. Their leader was a large man whose scarred face spoke of battles won through ruthlessness, rather than honor, his weapons worn with the familiarity of tools used daily in the business of taking what belonged to others. The attack began with arrows fired from long range, designed more to spread fear than to inflict casualties. The shafts struck adobe walls and wooden shutters with sounds that made women clutch their children closer and warriors grip their weapons with hands grown suddenly tight. This was the moment every defender had prepared for but hoped would never come. But as the raiders spurred their horses toward the village perimeter, confident in their overwhelming advantage, they could not have imagined that their carefully planned assault was about to encounter forces that existed beyond the realm of ordinary human conflict. In the barn behind the main battle line, a small Apache boy and a guardian spirit prepared to demonstrate that courage and wisdom could triumph over size and numbers. But the most unlikely heroes sometimes proved to be exactly what desperate situations required. The mule's ancient eyes held knowledge of battles fought across centuries, of times when the balance between good and evil hung on the actions of those who seemed least capable of affecting such enormous outcomes. Today would add another chapter to that long history, written by the smallest warrior Red Mesa had ever produced. As the sound of attacking horses grew close enough to feel through the ground beneath their feet, Aiyana placed his hand on the mule's neck and whispered words his grandmother had taught him, prayers to the ancestors who watched over the living, requests for strength to face impossible odds, and gratitude for the gift of partnership with powers beyond mortal understanding. The battle for Red Mesa was about to begin, and with it would come the first test of a destiny that neither raiders nor defenders could have anticipated. The sound of battle erupted across Red Mesa like thunder breaking over the desert, filling the morning air with war cries, the whistle of arrows and the clash of weapons meeting shields. From his defensive position behind the village's central well, Chief Cochise could see that his worst fears were being realized. The raiders were indeed professionals, men who understood how to coordinate their assault for maximum effectiveness while minimizing their own casualties. The attackers had divided into 3 groups, each approaching from a different direction, to prevent the defenders from concentrating their limited firepower. Their leader, a scarred man whose presence seemed to radiate cruelty, rode at the head of the largest group while shouting commands that his followers obeyed with the precision of soldiers rather than the chaos of common bandits. Aiyana crouched beside the barn door, watching the battle unfold with growing horror as he realized that the village's brave defenders were being overwhelmed by superior numbers and experience. Nalnish, the boy who had mocked him just yesterday, now fought beside his father with courage that made Aiyana's heart swell with unexpected admiration. But courage alone was not enough when facing odds of nearly 3-1. An arrow struck the adobe wall beside Aiyana's head, its steel point embedding deep in the sun-dried brick. The near miss sent him scrambling backward into the barn, his heart hammering with fear that threatened to paralyze his ability to think clearly. This was real violence, deadly and immediate, unlike anything he had experienced in his sheltered life. But as he pressed his back against the barn wall, trying to steady his breathing, Aiyana felt the mule's massive presence beside him. The guardian spirit had moved silently to his side, its ancient eyes holding depths of understanding that seemed to encompass not just this battle, but countless others, fought across the centuries when good people faced impossible odds. "I am afraid," Aiyana whispered, the admission feeling like failure even as the words left his lips. The mule lowered its great head until it was level with the boy's face, breath warm and steady against his cheek. In that moment, Aiyana felt knowledge flowing between them, not words, but understanding that transcended ordinary communication. Fear was natural, the mule's presence seemed to say, but courage was not the absence of fear. Courage was acting in spite of fear, choosing to do what was right even when everything inside screamed for safety. Outside, the sounds of combat grew more desperate as the raiders pressed their advantage. Aiyana could hear Chief Cochise shouting orders, trying to rally his warriors for a counterattack that might break the enemy's momentum. But the chief's voice carried an edge of desperation that suggested even his experienced leadership might not be sufficient for this crisis. "What can we do?" Aiyana asked the mule. "I am too small to fight like a warrior, and you are just one animal, no matter how strong." The mule's response was to move toward the barn door again, but this time with purpose that spoke of decision made and action about to be taken. The ancient bridle around its neck seemed to shimmer in the dim light, its mysterious symbols pulsing with energy that made the air itself feel alive with possibility. Aiyana followed the mule outside, where the full scope of the battle became clear. The raiders had breached the village outer defenses and were fighting hand-to-hand with Apache warriors, who gave ground reluctantly but steadily. Women and children huddled in the spaces between buildings, protected by older boys whose arrows flew with deadly accuracy but could not stem the tide of attackers. Then Aiyana saw something that filled him with desperate urgency. Near the village center, Shimasani had emerged from her hiding place to drag a wounded warrior to safety, her medicine bundle glowing softly as she worked to stanch his bleeding with herbs and prayers. But a raider on horseback had spotted her, spurring his mount toward the elderly woman, with sword raised to strike down someone he saw as an easy target. The woven blanket of stories that Shimasani had been working on for months lay scattered in the dust beside her, its intricate patterns telling the history of their people now trampled by enemy hooves. The artifact that preserved their cultural memory was being destroyed along with everything else the raiders touched. "Grandmother," Aiyana shouted, but his voice was lost in the chaos of battle. Without conscious thought, he grabbed the mule's ancient bridle and swung himself onto the massive animal's back. The mule required no guidance. It understood the threat as clearly as the boy did, and its response was immediate and overwhelming. They burst from behind the barn at a speed that defied natural law, the mule's hooves seeming to barely touch the ground as it covered the distance to Shimasani's position in heartbeats, rather than the long seconds such a charge should have required. The raider approaching the elderly woman had time only to register the sight of a small boy riding an impossibly large mule before the guardian spirit struck him with force that lifted both horse and rider from the ground. The raider's sword flew from nerveless fingers as he crashed into a pile of pottery, his horse scrambling away with eyes white with terror at encountering something beyond its understanding. Other attackers who had been pressing toward the village center stopped in confusion, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Aiyana slid from the mule's back to help his grandmother to her feet, his hands shaking with adrenaline and the aftermath of fear. Shimasani looked up at him with eyes that held no surprise, only pride and recognition that the moment she had long anticipated had finally arrived. "The Guardian has chosen well," she said simply, gathering up the scattered pieces of her story blanket, while around them the sounds of battle took on a different tone. The Apache warriors, who moments before had been fighting a losing battle against overwhelming odds, suddenly found themselves filled with new energy. The sight of their smallest member riding a spirit animal into combat had transformed fear into hope, desperation into determination. If little Apache could find courage to face armed raiders, then every defender could find strength to continue fighting. But the enemy leader had also witnessed Aiyana's charge, and his scarred face now held an expression of calculating interest rather than casual confidence. This was no ordinary village raid. There were forces at work here that he had not anticipated, forces that might require different strategies than simple, overwhelming violence. As the immediate crisis around his grandmother passed, Aiyana realized that their intervention had accomplished something more important than saving one life. They had changed the entire character of the battle, transforming it from a hopeless last stand into something else entirely. The real test of their partnership was just beginning. The raider leader's eyes narrowed as he studied the boy and the impossible animal that had just demolished one of his best fighters with contemptuous ease. Scarface Jack, as his men called him, had survived 15 years of raiding settlements across the southwest by adapting quickly to unexpected situations and never allowing surprise to paralyze his decision-making. But what he was witnessing challenged every assumption he had made about this supposedly easy target. The mule stood protectively over Aiyana and Shimasani, its massive frame radiating power that made nearby horses shy away with instinctive fear. The ancient bridle gleamed in the morning light, its mysterious symbols seeming to pulse with energy that spoke of forces beyond the normal world. Jack had encountered many strange things in his violent career, but never anything that suggested the involvement of supernatural powers in what should have been a straightforward massacre. "Fall back," he shouted to his men, his voice carrying clearly across the battlefield. "Regroup at the eastern ridge." The order confused his followers, who had been winning the battle decisively until the boy's intervention changed everything. But Jack's authority was absolute among the raiders, earned through demonstrations of ruthless competence that none of them cared to challenge. They began withdrawing from the village center, carrying their wounded while keeping weapons trained on defenders who were equally puzzled by the sudden retreat. Chief Kajiz emerged from behind his defensive position, the eagle feather staff still gripped in his weathered hands, but his expression transformed from grim determination to amazed relief. The sight of Aiyana, astride the magnificent mule, positioned protectively over the village's most honored elder, struck him with the force of prophecy fulfilled. "Little Apache," he called out, using the nickname that had always carried mockery, but now sounded like a title of respect. "What power do you command?" Aiyana slid from the mule's back, his legs unsteady as the immediate danger passed and reaction set in. "I command nothing, Chief Kajiz. This is Thunderhoof." The name came to him without conscious thought, emerging from the same deep understanding that had guided their partnership, and he chose me to help protect our people. The mule nickered softly at hearing its name spoken aloud for the first time, as if acknowledging that their bond had reached a new level of recognition. Thunderhoof moved closer to Aiyana, allowing the boy to lean against its powerful shoulder, while the village gathered around them in a circle of wonder and growing hope. Shimasani rose to her feet with dignity intact, despite the scattered remnants of her story blanket lying in the dust around her. She approached her grandson and the guardian spirit with the measured steps of a medicine woman participating in sacred ceremony. "The signal fire must be lit," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of generations. Other villagers need to know that Red Mesa still stands, that the ancient powers have returned to protect the people. A signal fire bowl sat atop the highest point in the village, a large stone vessel carved with protective symbols that had been used to communicate across great distances since before living memory. When filled with specially prepared materials and lit according to traditional ceremony, its smoke could be seen for many miles, carrying messages that other Apache settlements would understand and respond to. Young Nish stepped forward, his war paint smeared with dust and sweat, but his eyes bright with excitement that replaced his earlier fear. Little Apache Aiyana, can Thunderhoof really fight all those raiders? There are still 40 of them, and they have guns and steel weapons. Before Aiyana could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the return of immediate danger. The raiders had not retreated to lick their wounds, they had regrouped for a different kind of assault, one designed to test the limits of whatever supernatural protection the village had apparently acquired. Scarface Jack rode at the head of a wedge formation, his remaining fighters arranged behind him in a disciplined charge that would concentrate their firepower on the boy and his mysterious mount. If he could eliminate this unexpected element, the battle would return to familiar terms that favored his superior numbers and equipment. "Kill the boy and his animal," Jack shouted as they thundered toward the village center. "Everything else is just superstitious nonsense." But as the raiders closed the distance, Thunderhoof demonstrated abilities that transcended mere physical power. The mule began to move in patterns that seemed to bend space itself, appearing in one location and instantly materializing in another, always positioned to intercept attacks before they could reach their intended targets. Aiyana found himself swept along in movements that felt like flying, his small frame perfectly balanced on Thunderhoof's back as they wove between charging horses and slashing weapons with grace that belonged more to dance than combat. The ancient bridle symbols blazed with light that made the raiders' horses rear and bolt, refusing to approach closer to whatever power they sensed radiating from the guardian spirit. "The children," Shimasani called out urgently. "Protect the children." Aiyana saw immediately what his grandmother meant. While the main raider force engaged with Thunderhoof, a smaller group had circled around to attack the shelters where the village's youngest members huddled in terror. These men understood that taking hostages would force the Apache defenders to surrender, regardless of whatever supernatural assistance they had acquired. Thunderhoof responded to Aiyana's unspoken understanding, launching them both toward the threatened children with speed that left the attacking raiders far behind. But as they moved to intercept this new threat, Aiyana realized they were being drawn away from the main battle, potentially leaving the adult defenders vulnerable to renewed assault. The signal firebowl remained unlit, its potential for summoning help from neighboring villages unrealized, while the immediate crisis demanded all their attention. Other Apache settlements lay within a day's hard riding, but they would need to know that Red Mesa required assistance if they were to arrive in time to matter. "Kaya," Aiyana called to his younger cousin, who crouched near the signal fire's base with several other children. "Can you light the ceremonial fire? Can you send the message that we need help?" The 8-year-old girl looked up at him with eyes that held both fear and determination. Like all Apache children, she had been taught the traditional ways, including the proper methods for creating smoke signals that would carry across the desert to watching eyes in distant villages. "I know the way," she called back, already gathering the special materials needed for the fire. "But I need protection while I work." Thunderhoof wheeled toward the new threat, carrying Aiyana into what he was beginning to understand would be a battle fought on multiple fronts, simultaneously. The raiders were learning to adapt their tactics to counter supernatural intervention, spreading their attacks to force impossible choices between protecting different groups of vulnerable villagers. As morning advanced toward midday, the true scope of their challenge became clear. This would not be won through a single heroic charge or dramatic confrontation. Victory would require sustained courage, tactical thinking, and the kind of partnership between human wisdom and supernatural power that legends were built upon. The signal fire's smoke began to rise toward the clouded sky, carrying messages of hope and desperation across distances that would determine whether Red Mesa's resistance could evolve from brave last stand into sustainable defense. The smoke column climbed straight and true into the morning air, its distinctive pattern telling other Apache settlements that Red Mesa faced dire threat but continued to resist. Kaya had performed the lighting ceremony with precision beyond her years, her small hands steady as she arranged the sacred materials that would create smoke visible for many miles across the desert landscape. But even as hope rose with the signal fire, immediate danger pressed closer. The raiders attacking the children's shelter had been forced back by Thunderhoof's intervention, but Scarface Jack was proving himself a cunning opponent who learned quickly from each encounter. He had positioned his remaining fighters in a loose circle around the village, using their superior numbers to maintain constant pressure while avoiding direct confrontation with the supernatural power that had already cost him several men. Aiyana could feel Thunderhoof's energy beginning to show signs of strain. The guardian spirit possessed abilities that transcended natural law, but even supernatural power had limits when facing prolonged conflict. Each spectacular demonstration, speed and strength drew from reserves that, while vast, were not infinite. "We cannot fight them all at once," Aiyana whispered to his magnificent partner, his small hands gripping the ancient bridle as they paused behind the cover of the village's central well. "We need to make them come to us on our terms." Thunderhoof's response was to turn toward the sound of approaching hoofbeats. But this time the approaching riders wore the familiar clothing and war paint of Apache warriors rather than the rough leather and metal of desert raiders. The signal fire had been answered with remarkable speed. Chief Standing Bear of the Painted Canyon settlement rode at the head of 20 fresh fighters, their arrival shifting the balance of power in ways that made Scarface Jack's tactical situation suddenly much less favorable. Red Mesa calls for aid and the Painted Canyon answers. Standing Bear shouted as his warriors spread out to flank the surprised raiders. His voice carried the authority of a man who had never lost a battle, whose reputation for strategic brilliance was matched only by his courage in personal combat. The new arrivals brought more than just additional fighters. They carried with them a large hunting knife that gleamed with more than mere steel polish. The blade had been passed down through generations of Apache war leaders, its surface etched with symbols that represented victories won when unity between different tribal groups. This was not just a weapon, but a symbol of alliance that transformed Red Mesa's isolated struggle into something larger and more significant. Scarface Jack realized immediately that his carefully planned raid had evolved into something far beyond his experience or resource. Fighting a single village was one thing, but facing a coordinated response from multiple Apache settlements was another matter entirely. His men were tough and experienced, but they were outnumbered now, and the arrival of fresh fighters had energized the Red Mesa defenders in ways that made continued assault extremely dangerous. "This is not over, boy," he shouted across the battlefield toward Aiyana, his scarred face twisted with rage at seeing easy conquest transformed into potential defeat. "I know who you are now, and I know what you ride. There are others who will pay well for such information." The threat carried implications that made Shimasani's expression darken with concern she tried to hide from her grandson. If word spread that Red Mesa possessed supernatural protection, it would attract attention from forces far more dangerous than common raiders. There were men in the territorial capitals who collected strange creatures and powerful artifacts for purposes that went well beyond simple greed. But immediate concerns took precedence over future worries. The combined Apache forces were pressing their advantage, driving the raiders back toward the ridgelines where their horses would be vulnerable to pursuit across open ground. Thunderhoof seemed to sense that the tide had turned, his massive frame vibrating with energy that spoke of readiness for a decisive push that would end the threat to Red Mesa permanently. "Can you run them down?" Aiyana asked quietly, understanding that this might be their opportunity to finish what the raiders had started. Thunderhoof's response was to launch into motion that carried them both toward the retreating enemies at a speed that made pursuit seem almost effortless. But as they closed the distance, Aiyana began to notice something troubling about the raiders' retreat. It was too organized, too disciplined for men facing defeat. Scarface Jack was not fleeing in panic. He was executing a strategic withdrawal that suggested this encounter was far from over. The raider leader had positioned several of his best marksmen in concealed positions along the retreat route, their rifles trained on the path that any pursuit would necessarily follow. As Thunderhoof and Aiyana approached the killing ground, gunfire erupted from hidden positions that had been carefully prepared for exactly this scenario. Bullets whistled through the air around them, some striking the ground so close that dirt and stone fragments peppered Aiyana's legs. Thunderhoof's supernatural abilities protected them from direct hits, but the concentrated fire was intense enough to force them to seek cover behind a large boulder that offered temporary protection from the ambush. They planned this, Aiyana realized, his voice tight with understanding of how close they had come to riding into a trap that would have ended their partnership and Red Mesa's hopes simultaneously. The retreat was meant to draw us into their gun. From behind their rocky shelter, they could hear Scarface Jack's laughter echoing across the desert, a sound that held more menace than anger. The man had demonstrated tactical skills that went well beyond common banditry. He was thinking several moves ahead, using their own success against them in ways that suggested extensive experience fighting opponents who possessed advantages he could not match directly. Next time, Spirit Ride, Jack's voice carried clearly in the desert air. Next time I will be ready for your tricks. The sound of retreating horses gradually faded into the distance, leaving behind a battlefield littered with evidence of conflict, but no clear resolution. The raiders had been driven off, but they remained intact as a fighting force, and their leader had demonstrated both intelligence and determination that promised future encounters would be even more dangerous. Standing Bear approached their position with several of his warriors, their faces showing a mixture of admiration and concern as they took in the sight of Red Mesa's youngest defender, partnered with a creature that existed beyond ordinary understanding. "You have done well, young warrior," the chief said formally, acknowledging Aiyana with the respect due to someone who had proven himself in combat. "But this is only the beginning. Word of what happened here today will spread, and it will bring challenges that make today's raiders seem like children playing war games." Aiyana looked up at the older chief, his mind still processing the intensity of what they had just experienced. "What kind of challenges?" Standing Bear's expression grew somber as he considered how to explain realities that no 10-year-old should have to face. "The kind that will test not just your courage, but your wisdom. The kind that will force you to choose between safety and duty, between hiding your gifts and using them to protect others who cannot protect themselves." As if summoned by the chief's words, Thunderhoof moved closer to Aiyana, the guardian spirit's ancient eyes holding depths of knowledge that spoke of similar choices faced across countless generations. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, bound by partnership that had already proven capable of achieving what seemed impossible. But as the smoke from Kaya's signal fire continued to climb toward the clouded sky, carrying news of their victory to distant villages, none of them could have imagined that their greatest trial was still approaching, drawn by the very success that had saved Red Mesa from destruction. The celebration that followed their victory was subdued by Apache standards, marked more by relief than triumph. The village had survived its first major test in living memory, but at a cost that sobered even the youngest children. 3 warriors had been wounded seriously enough to require Shimasani's most powerful healing medicines, and the damage to buildings and supplies would take weeks to repair fully. More troubling was the knowledge that Scarface Jack remained at large with most of his force intact. The raider leader had demonstrated tactical intelligence that elevated him far above common bandits, and his parting threat about spreading word of Thunderhoof's existence promised complications that no one in Red Mesa was prepared to handle. Aiyana found himself the center of attention in ways that felt both gratifying and overwhelming. Children who had mocked him just days before now followed him with expressions of awe, hoping to touch Thunderhoof's magnificent coat or hear stories of what it felt like to ride a guardian spirit into battle. Adults who had dismissed his contributions to village life now sought his opinions on defense strategies and asked his advice about preparations for future attacks. The transformation was dizzying for a boy who had never experienced respect rather than tolerance from his community. But with recognition came responsibilities that weighed heavily on shoulders that seemed far too small for such burdens. "The thunder drum calls for ceremony," Shimasani announced 3 days after the battle, her voice carrying across the village with the authority of generations. The ancient instrument sat in the center of the ceremonial ground, a massive drum crafted from materials that included wood from trees, struck by lightning, hide from animals that had lived in sacred places, and bindings made sinew taken from creatures that existed between the mortal world and the realm of spirits. When beaten according to traditional patterns, the thunder drum was said to call upon ancestral spirits for guidance and protection. Its deep, resonant voice could be heard for miles across the desert, carrying prayers and requests to powers that watched over the Apache people from beyond the boundaries of ordinary existence. Chief Cochise had decided that Aiyana's partnership with Thunderhoof required formal recognition through ceremonies that would bind their alliance according to ancient protocols. Such rituals had not been performed in living memory, but the elders had preserved the knowledge in stories and songs that could guide them through the proper procedures. The ceremony began at sunset, with the entire village gathered in a circle around the thunder drum, while sacred fires cast dancing shadows across faces painted with symbols of protection and blessing. Aiyana knelt beside Thunderhoof at the circle's center, both of them positioned to receive the community's prayers and the spirit's attention. Standing Bear had remained in Red Mesa to witness the ceremony, bringing with him elders from Painted Canyon, whose knowledge of traditional ways complemented what Red Mesa's people remembered. The combination of wisdom from both settlements created a more complete understanding of what such partnerships had meant in the distant past, when guardian spirits regularly walked among the Apache people. "Long ago," Chief Cochise intoned, his voice blending with the thunder drum's deep rhythm, "our ancestors knew creatures like Thunderhoof, beings that appeared in times of greatest need to partner with those whose hearts were pure and whose courage exceeded their fear. These alliances were sacred, blessed by the spirits of earth and sky, protected by powers that exist beyond the reach of ordinary weapons." The ceremony continued through the night, with prayers offered in ancient languages that few present fully understood, but all recognized as sacred. Herbs were burned to purify the air. Eagle feathers were waved to carry messages to the sky. Spirits and water from the village's sacred spring was used to bless both boy and guardian spirit. But as dawn approached, the solemnity of the ceremony was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Not the thunderous charge of attacking raiders, but the steady rhythm of riders who came in peace under the white flag of truce. A delegation from the territorial capital had arrived, led by a man whose expensive clothing and military bearing marked him as someone accustomed to authority and respect. Colonel Harrison Mitchell rode at the head of 6 soldiers, whose equipment and bearing suggested professional competence rather than frontier roughness. "I am here on behalf of the territorial governor," Mitchell announced as his horse picked its way carefully between the sacred fires, still burning from the night's ceremony. "We have received reports of unusual events in this area, reports that require official investigation." Chief Cochise rose from his position beside the thunder drum, his expression carefully neutral despite the timing of this interruption. "Red Mesa welcomes visitors who come in peace. But this is sacred ground during sacred time. Perhaps your business could wait until our ceremonies are complete." Mitchell's smile was polite, but carried undertones that suggested he was not accustomed to being asked to wait for anything. "I'm afraid the nature of my business makes delay inadvisable. We have reports of a child in this village who has formed some sort of alliance with an animal of unusual size and capabilities. Such reports, if true, represent matters of territorial security that require immediate attention." The words fell into the ceremonial circle like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of tension that spread through the gathered villagers. Aiyana felt Thunderhoof move closer to him, the guardian spirit's massive presence offering comfort while simultaneously drawing the attention that both of them would have preferred to avoid. There are many stories told around campfires. Standing Bear said carefully, his diplomatic experience helping him navigate the dangerous currents of this encounter. Not all of them reflect the truth of daylight hour. But Colonel Mitchell's eyes had already found Aiyana and Thunderhoof, and his expression showed recognition rather than skepticism. Indeed, there are many stories, but the evidence suggests that this particular story may be more substantial than most. He gestured toward one of his soldiers, who produced a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be detailed sketches and written reports. The drawings showed remarkable accuracy in depicting both Aiyana and Thunderhoof, complete with details that could only have come from eyewitness observation. "Scarface Jack," Aiyana whispered, understanding immediately where such detailed information must have originated. "Among others," Mitchell confirmed, his tone suggesting that the raider leader was merely one source among many. Word of unusual events travels quickly in the territories, especially when those events involve capabilities that might be of interest to people in positions of authority. But as Mitchell spoke, Thunderhoof rose to his feet with deliberate slowness, the guardian spirit's massive frame radiating power that made the colonel's horses shift nervously, despite being held by experienced handlers. The ancient eyes held depths of knowledge that encompassed not just this moment, but the long history of such encounters between power and those who sought to control it. "Some things cannot be commanded," Nate said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "Some partnerships exist beyond the reach of territorial authority." Mitchell's gaze sharpened as he studied the old woman, recognizing that her words represented more than simple defiance. "With respect, grandmother, territorial authority extends wherever territorial law applies, and territorial law applies throughout this region. Does it apply to the spirit world?" Aiyana asked suddenly, the question emerging from understanding that was growing within him as he felt Thunderhoof's responses to the colonel's proposals. "Does territorial law command the ancestors who sent Thunderhoof to protect the people?" The question struck at the heart of Mitchell's assumptions about authority and control. His legal and military training had prepared him for resistance based on political or economic concerns, but not for challenges that questioned the fundamental scope of governmental power. "The boy raises an interesting point," Standing Bear observed, his diplomatic skills finding advantage in the philosophical direction the conversation had taken. "If Thunderhoof serves powers that existed long before territorial government, can territorial government claim jurisdiction over their purposes?" Mitchell's composure slipped slightly as he realized that the negotiation had moved beyond simple discussions of cooperation and resistance into questions that challenged the basic assumptions underlying his mission. How could territorial law govern supernatural forces that acknowledged no earthly authority? But even as the adults debated jurisdiction and philosophy, Aiyana was learning something more important from his connection with Thunderhoof. The guardian spirit's purpose was not to serve human governments of any kind, but to maintain balance between forces that most people never recognized or understood. That balance was shifting now, threatened not just by raiders who took what they wanted through violence, but by authorities who sought to control what they could not comprehend. The real test of their partnership was not defeating obvious enemies, but navigating the more subtle dangers posed by those who claimed to help while pursuing their own purposes. As night fell over Red Mesa, casting the territorial delegation's campfires into sharp relief against the darkness, Aiyana understood that tomorrow would bring choices that would determine not just his own future, but the fate of everything Thunderhoof had been sent to protect. The decision came sooner than expected, announced by the sound of many horses approaching through the desert darkness. But these were not territorial reinforcements or Apache allies. The hoofbeats carried a different rhythm, faster and more urgent, speaking of riders who traveled with desperate purpose through terrain that should have been too dangerous for night movement. Scarface Jack had returned, but not alone. The raider leader rode at the head of nearly 60 fighters, a force assembled from outlaw bands across the territory who had been drawn by his promises of extraordinary plunder. Word of territorial government interest in Red Mesa had spread through criminal networks with the same efficiency that carried news between Apache settlements, and the implications had not been lost on men who understood that government attention often preceded government protection. Tonight or never. Jack's voice carried clearly across the valley as his enlarged force spread out to encircle the village completely. The soldiers will be gone by morning, and we'll face only the boy and his beast again. But this time, we're ready for spirit trick. From his position near the thunder drum, Aiyana could see that Jack's preparations had indeed been extensive. Many of the raiders carried torches that would eliminate the darkness Thunderhoof had used for concealment during their previous encounter. Others bore nets and ropes designed to entangle even supernatural creatures, while the most experienced fighters had positioned themselves to create overlapping fields of fire that would make the guardian spirit's remarkable speed less effective. Colonel Mitchell emerged from his tent with weapons drawn, his soldiers forming a defensive perimeter around their camp with professional efficiency. But 60 experienced raiders represented a threat that 6 territorial soldiers could not hope to contain, regardless of their superior training and equipment. Chief Kachis, Mitchell called across the distance separating their position. My offer of protection stands, but it requires immediate acceptance. My men and I cannot defend the entire village against such numbers without your cooperation. The words carried implications that were clear to everyone present. Mitchell was offering to protect Red Mesa from the raider attack, but only if the village agreed to his terms regarding Aiyana and Thunderhoof. It was an ultimatum disguised as assistance, forcing immediate decision under circumstances that made refusal seem like choosing destruction. But Thunderhoof's response was immediate and unmistakable. The guardian spirit moved to the center of the village plaza, positioning himself where every villager could see the ancient bridal symbols blazing with light that pushed back the darkness. The magnificent animal's message was clear. He had not been sent by the ancestors to serve territorial politics, but to protect the people according to purposes that transcended human authority. Aiyana felt knowledge flowing between them that was deeper than words or even thoughts, understanding of power that existed to serve balance rather than dominion, of strength that grew from harmony rather than control. The raiders represented obvious threat that could be met with obvious response. The territorial soldiers represented more subtle danger that required different wisdom. Elder Naish appeared beside them as if materialized from the darkness itself, her weathered hands carrying tracking stones worn smooth by generations of use in navigation and ceremony. The small river rocks had guided Apache travelers across vast distances for countless years, their surfaces marked with symbols that indicated direction, distance, and the location of sacred places. The old paths call, she said simply, offering the stones to Aiyana with gestures that spoke of ceremony more ancient than any government. Thunderhoof knows the way to safety, but only if you trust the ancestors' guidance over the promises of strangers. Aiyana understood immediately what she meant. There were places in the desert known only to the Apache people, hidden canyons and sacred valleys that could shelter entire communities while remaining invisible to outside searchers. Thunderhoof's supernatural abilities could transport them to such refuge, but it would require abandoning everything they had built in Red Mesa. We cannot leave, Chief Kachis said firmly, having overheard Naish's suggestion. This is our home, our responsibility to ancestors who are buried in this ground. Running from danger does not solve the problem, it only moves it elsewhere. The approaching raiders had grown close enough that individual voices could be distinguished in their war cries, languages that spoke of violence and conquest echoing across the desert. Their torchlight revealed preparations that confirmed Jack's claim of being ready for supernatural intervention, specialized equipment, and coordinated tactics designed to counter abilities that no ordinary animal possessed. Colonel Mitchell's soldiers had taken positions that demonstrated professional competence, but their defensive formation was clearly designed to protect the territorial delegation rather than the village as a whole. Their offer of protection was conditional upon immediate acceptance of Mitchell's terms, creating artificial urgency that served territorial interests rather than Apache welfare. "Choose quickly," Mitchell called out, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of approaching enemy. "My protection is available now, but may not be later." But as Aiyana looked around the plaza at faces illuminated by torchlight and the glow from Thunderhoof's ancient bridle, he saw expressions that reflected not fear, but determination. These were people who had survived countless challenges through unity and mutual support, who understood that some things were worth defending regardless of cost. Young Narnis stepped forward, his war paint freshly applied and his weapons ready for the battle that was approaching. "Little Apache," he said formally, using the nickname that had once carried mockery, but now sounded like a title of honor. "Tell us what you need from us." Other voices joined his warriors, women, children old enough to understand the choice being presented. They were not asking to be protected by superior force or government authority. They were asking to be part of whatever solution Aiyana and Thunderhoof could provide, willing to risk everything for the right to remain free. The tracking stones in Naish's weathered hands seemed to pulse with their own light as the moment of decision arrived. Behind them lay paths to safety that would preserve lives, but abandon everything that made those lives worth preserving. Ahead lay dangers that could destroy them all, but also the possibility of victory that would prove some things remained beyond the reach of those who sought to control them. Thunderhoof's ancient eyes met Aiyana's gaze with understanding that transcended the need for words. Whatever choice the boy made, the guardian spirit would support with all the power at his command. But the choice itself belonged to the human partner in their alliance, the small Apache boy who had grown into responsibilities far larger than his physical size. As the sound of attacking raiders grew closer and territorial soldiers awaited his decision, Aiyana felt the weight of leadership settling on shoulders that had learned to bear burdens beyond their apparent capacity. The real test of their partnership was about to begin. The decision crystallized in Aiyana's mind, with the clarity that comes when all other options fall away. He would not accept Mitchell's conditional protection that would make Thunderhoof a tool of territorial authority. He would not flee to hidden canyons that would preserve their lives while abandoning their home. Instead, they would stand and fight, demonstrating that some partnerships existed beyond the reach of those who sought to control them. "We stay," he announced, his young voice carrying clearly across the plaza to reach both territorial soldiers and approaching raiders. "Red Mesa is our home, and Thunderhoof was sent to protect it, not to serve strangers or hide in distant places." Thunderhoof's response was immediate and magnificent. The guardian spirit reared up on his hind legs, his massive form silhouetted against the night sky, while the ancient bridle blazed with light that seemed to challenge both the raiders' torches and the territorial soldiers' authority. The message was unmistakable. This was a power that acknowledged no master save the purposes for which it had been sent. The raiders struck from 3 directions simultaneously, their coordinated assault designed to overwhelm defenders through superior numbers, while preventing concentration of resistance at any single point. But Scarface Jack had failed to understand the fundamental nature of what he was attacking. This was not merely a village defended by an unusually large mule, but a community protected by forces that existed beyond the normal world. Thunderhoof's first charge took him directly into the largest group of attackers, his supernatural speed allowing him to appear among them before their torches could track his movement. Raiders who had prepared nets and ropes found themselves facing a creature whose reality exceeded their ability to contain or predict. The guardian spirit moved through their ranks like storm wind through wheat fields, leaving chaos and confusion in his wake. But Jack's tactical improvements proved more effective than his previous attempts. Several raiders had positioned themselves specifically to attack Aiyana rather than Thunderhoof, understanding that separating the partners might neutralize both of them. Crossbow bolts whistled past the boy's head as he guided his magnificent mount through the melee, their deadly accuracy forcing him to rely on Thunderhoof's supernatural awareness to avoid attacks that conventional reflexes could never have detected. In the deepest part of the canyon that bordered Red Mesa's eastern edge, ancient rock formations created a natural amphitheater where Apache voices had echoed for generations during ceremonies too sacred for ordinary ground. At the center of this space stood a massive boulder known as the Echo Stone, its surface worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, its shape creating acoustic properties that amplified sound in ways that seemed to defy natural law. As the battle raged across the village plaza, Thunderhoof began moving toward this sacred location with purpose that Aiyana felt through their connection rather than understood through conscious thought. The guardian spirit was leading them toward ground, where different laws applied, where the balance between supernatural and mundane tilted in favor of forces that existed beyond ordinary understanding. "Follow us," Aiyana called to the Apache defenders, his voice carrying clearly despite the chaos of combat. The Echo Stone calls. Chief Cochise understood immediately, recognizing both the tactical and existential significance of Aiyana's choice. The canyon approach would force the raiders into a narrow space where their superior numbers would become disadvantageous, while the Echo Stone's presence would amplify whatever supernatural abilities Thunderhoof possessed. But Colonel Mitchell's soldiers faced a different calculation. Their mission was to protect the territorial delegation and secure cooperation regarding Aiyana and Thunderhoof, not to participate in Apache spiritual ceremonies on sacred ground where their authority might prove meaningless. "This is your last chance for territorial protection," Mitchell called out as his men began withdrawing toward their original positions. "Once you leave village boundaries, you're beyond our ability to assist." The warning carried implications beyond immediate military support. If Red Mesa chose to rely on supernatural protection rather than territorial authority, they would forfeit any claim to future government assistance. They would become truly independent, responsible for their own defense against all enemies, relying entirely on powers that existed outside conventional understanding. The chase toward the Echo Stone became a running battle that tested every participant's courage and commitment. Raiders pursued Apache defenders through terrain that grew increasingly treacherous as they moved away from familiar ground toward sacred places that most outsiders had never seen. Thunderhoof's supernatural abilities allowed him to navigate obstacles that would have stopped ordinary horses. But some of Jack's more experienced men proved surprisingly capable of following routes that should have been impossible for non-Apache riders. As they approached the canyon's entrance, the character of the conflict began to change. The raiders' torches, so effective in the open plaza, provided less advantage in the twisting passages where shadows played tricks with perception, and echoing sounds confused attempts at coordination. Meanwhile, Thunderhoof seemed to grow stronger as they moved deeper into sacred territory, his connection to spiritual forces becoming more pronounced the closer they came to the Echo Stone. Aiyana could feel power building around them like pressure before a thunderstorm, energy that spoke of ancient purposes finally reaching their moment of fulfillment. The guardian spirit had been waiting not just for this battle, but for this place, where the balance between worlds would tip decisively in favor of those who served harmony rather than dominion. The Echo Stone stood exactly as Aiyana remembered from childhood visits with his grandmother, its massive form seeming to absorb starlight and transform it into something deeper than ordinary illumination. As Thunderhoof approached the sacred boulder, the ancient bridal symbols began pulsing with rhythms that matched the boy's heartbeat, creating resonance that made the very air seem alive with possibility. Behind them, Scarface Jack's raiders entered the canyon with the confident advance of men who believed superior numbers and firepower could overcome any obstacle. They had followed their quarry into what appeared to be a trap of the defenders' own making, a dead-end canyon where escape would be impossible and victory would require only patience and concentrated fire. What they could not have anticipated was that they were entering a place where different rules applied, where the accumulated prayers and ceremonies of generations had created conditions favorable to forces they did not understand or respect. The Echo Stone had witnessed the calling of guardian spirits before, and it was ready to witness such calling again. As the final confrontation approached, Aiyana understood that this would be more than a battle between raiders and defenders. This would be a test of whether ancient powers could still protect those who honored them, whether the partnership between human wisdom and supernatural strength could triumph over the crude dominance that modern conflicts seemed to favor. The Echo Stone waited in patient silence, ready to amplify whatever voices would speak in the sacred canyon. When the moment of ultimate testing arrived, the final confrontation began not with the clash of weapons, but with silence so complete that every participant could hear their own heartbeat echoing off the canyon walls. Scarface Jack's raiders had followed the Apache defenders into what they assumed was a trap of their own making, a dead-end canyon where superior numbers would guarantee victory. But as they spread out in attack formation, something in the quality of the silence began to unnerve even the most experienced fighters. The Echo Stone dominated the canyon's heart like an altar, built by forces that existed long before human habitation. Its surface seemed to drink in the raiders' torchlight while reflecting something else entirely, a luminescence that spoke of accumulated prayers and ceremonies, of generations who had sought guidance and protection in this sacred place. Around its base, the ground itself felt different underfoot, as if the very earth acknowledged its spiritual significance. Thunderhoof positioned himself between the Echo Stone and the approaching raiders, his massive form seeming to grow even larger in the confined space of the canyon. The ancient bridle blazed with symbols that painted moving patterns of light across the rocky walls, creating illusions that made it difficult for attackers to judge distance and direction accurately. Aiyana felt power building around them that exceeded anything they had experienced during their previous encounters. This was not merely the guardian spirit's supernatural abilities, but the accumulated spiritual energy of a place where the boundary between worlds had grown thin through centuries of sacred use. The Echo Stone was ready to amplify not just voices, but the very essence of whatever forces chose to manifest in its presence. "Surrender the boy and his creature," Scarface Jack commanded, his voice echoing strangely off the canyon walls in ways that made his own words sound distorted and uncertain. "You're trapped with nowhere to run. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." But Chief Kashiza's response came not from his own throat, but from the Echo Stone itself, the sacred boulder, somehow capturing and amplifying his words, until they filled the entire canyon with resonance that seemed to come from the earth itself. "We do not surrender what the ancestors have sent to protect us," the chief's amplified voice declared. "If you seek to take by force what cannot be owned by force, then face the consequences of challenging powers greater than your understanding." The raiders shifted nervously as they realized that something beyond normal acoustics was affecting sound in the canyon. Their own voices seemed muffled and distorted when they tried to respond, while Apache words rang with clarity and power that suggested supernatural assistance. Scarface Jack, recognizing that psychological warfare was working against him, ordered the attack with sharp commands that his men obeyed despite growing uneasiness about their tactical situation. 60 experienced fighters should have been more than sufficient to overwhelm a handful of Apache defenders and one large mule, regardless of the terrain's acoustic properties. What they encountered instead challenged every assumption they had made about the nature of reality itself. Thunderhoof's charge toward the attacking raiders seemed to bend space and time around the sacred ground, his movement creating multiple images that confused targeting while his actual position remained impossible to predict. The guardian spirit appeared to be in several places simultaneously, striking different groups of attackers with force that sent men and horses flying through the air to crash against canyon walls with impacts that should have been fatal, but somehow left them merely stunned and demoralized. But the true power of their partnership emerged when Aiyana began to sing. The song came from somewhere deeper than conscious memory, ancient words in languages that predated written history, melodies that had been passed down through generations of medicine people who understood the connection between voice and spirit. As his young voice joined with the echo stone's amplification, the very air in the canyon began to vibrate with frequencies that touched something primal in every living thing present. The raiders' horses reared and bolted despite their training, refusing to approach closer to whatever power was manifesting around the echo stone. Several of the men dropped their weapons as the singing affected their ability to maintain aggressive intentions, their minds overwhelmed by exposure to harmonies that bypassed conscious thought to touch deeper levels of consciousness. Thunderhoof's movements became a dance that matched the rhythm of Aiyana's song. The guardian spirit's supernatural abilities synchronized with spiritual forces that transformed the canyon into a place where miracles seemed not just possible but inevitable. Light that had no source illuminated the sacred space with radiance that made torches seem dim and inadequate. Scarface Jack, realizing that conventional tactics were useless against whatever power he was facing, pulled out a heavy rifle designed for hunting the largest game. If supernatural abilities protected the boy and his mount against normal weapons, perhaps overwhelming firepower could succeed where strategy had failed. But as he raised the rifle to his shoulder, taking careful aim at Aiyana's small form, the echo stone's amplification turned his own heartbeat into thunder that shook dust from the canyon walls. The weapon's weight seemed to increase impossibly, his hands trembling with strain that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. Some things cannot be taken by force. Elder Naish's voice echoed from somewhere beyond the raider's sight, her words carrying across the canyon with the authority of absolute truth. Some partnerships exist in realms where bullets have no power. The final test came when Jack, in desperate fury, fired his rifle directly at the echo stone itself, apparently believing that destroying the source of acoustic amplification might break whatever spell was protecting his enemies. The bullet struck the sacred boulder with a sound like thunder, but instead of shattering stone, it seemed to disappear entirely into the rock surface. A moment later, the echo stone began to sing. The sound that emerged from the ancient boulder was unlike anything any human ear had ever heard. Harmonies that seemed to contain every song ever sung in the canyon. Melodies that spoke of the connection between earth and sky. Rhythms that matched the heartbeat of the world itself. The raiders who remained conscious fell to their knees as the music washed over them, their aggressive intentions dissolved by exposure to beauty that transcended their ability to process or resist. Even Aiyana was overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening, his own voice lost in the cosmic symphony that flowed from the awakened stone. But Thunderhoof remained steady beneath him, the guardian spirit serving as an anchor that prevented the boy from being swept away by forces too vast for mortal comprehension. The battle was over, won not through violence, but through the demonstration of power that existed on levels where violence had no meaning. The raiders had been defeated not by superior force, but by exposure to realities that challenged their fundamental assumptions about what was possible in the world they thought they understood. As the Echo Stone's song gradually faded to silence, leaving only echoes that seemed to linger in the air like blessings, Aiyana realized that something profound had changed, not just in the canyon, but in himself. He was no longer merely a small boy who had found partnership with a guardian spirit. He had become a bridge between worlds, a living connection between the ancient powers that watched over the Apache people and the modern challenges that threatened their survival. The victory was complete, but its consequences would extend far beyond the defeat of a single band of raiders. The aftermath of the canyon confrontation unfolded with the quiet dignity that marked significant moments in Apache tradition. The defeated raiders, their aggressive intentions dissolved by exposure to forces they could neither understand or resist, gathered their wounded and departed the sacred ground with expressions of bewilderment rather than anger. Scarface Jack himself seemed transformed by the experience, his scarred features holding a thoughtfulness that spoke of fundamental assumptions being challenged and reformed. "This is not how such things usually end," he admitted to Chief Corges, as his men prepared to leave the canyon. The raider leader's voice carried none of its previous arrogance, replaced by the humility that comes when someone encounters realities larger than their previous understanding. "I have seen many battles, faced many enemies, but never anything like what happened here." Chief Corges nodded with the gracious bearing of a man whose victory had been won through wisdom rather than violence. "The ancestors teach us that some conflicts cannot be resolved through force, only through understanding. Perhaps what you witnessed will serve you better than what you intended to take." As the raiders departed, leading their horses through terrain that no longer seemed hostile but merely indifferent to their presence, the Echo Stone gradually returned to its normal appearance. Supernatural radiance faded to ordinary starlight, reflecting off ancient rock. But the sense of profound change lingered in the air like incense from completed ceremony. Village feast bowl celebrations had been a tradition in Red Mesa for as long as anyone could remember, marking important occasions with communal meals that strengthened the bonds between families and generations. The large ceremonial vessel that served as the centerpiece for such gatherings was carved from wood, taken from trees that had witnessed the passage of centuries, its surface decorated with symbols representing abundance, gratitude, and the connection between human community and natural cycles. 3 days after the canyon confrontation, Chief Kachisi announced that such a celebration would honor not just their victory over external threats, but the spiritual awakening that had transformed one of their smallest members into a bridge between worlds. The feast bowl was filled with foods contributed by every family in the village, creating a meal that represented the diversity and unity of their community. But the celebration was tempered by awareness that their triumph had attracted attention from sources far beyond Scarface Jack's defeated raiders. Colonel Mitchell's territorial soldiers had observed the canyon events from a distance, their reports certain to reach officials whose interest in supernatural capabilities would be far more sophisticated than simple military conquest. "Word will spread," Elder Naish warned, as she sat beside Aiyana during the feast, her weathered hands working steadily on a new piece of beadwork that incorporated symbols representing their recent experiences. "There are men in the territorial capitals who collect strange creatures and powerful artifacts for purposes that go beyond simple greed or conquest. They will come with offers that sound generous and threats that seem reasonable." Aiyana understood the implications of her warning. The territorial government's interest had been demonstrated by Mitchell's visit, but that had been merely preliminary investigation. That official reports would confirm the existence of genuinely supernatural capabilities, more sophisticated approaches would follow. "What should we do?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer from his growing connection with Thunderhoof and the wisdom that flowed through their partnership. "We do what the people have always done when faced with forces larger than ourselves," Shimasani replied from her position of honor near the feast bowl.